So I felt like last week's sermon was particularly hard. It was easy to preach, but it was hard to listen to, even for the preacher, because of how it challenges us. So I asked God for a softball. What I mean by that is, and Chester knows this because we both worked for a preacher who, when he gave a very difficult sermon, would tell you in staff meeting, I got to do a softball this week. Like, you can't just pull people out of their comfort zone constantly. Even Jesus doesn't do that. He does it a little bit today, but he goes a place that I kind of didn't expect, and we start with this idea of what happens. How do we make sense of when bad things happen to people and we can't figure out the reason why? And it made me think of those times in my life when I have grieved. Now, grief is different for everybody, but there are a number of things that are common to us that we grieve together. By far the most difficult thing to grieve in all of life, and this is universal across cultures. I looked it up. You can use Google and you can find these answers, you know what I mean? So I looked it up, and the most universal things that we grieve are the loss of a spouse or a child. There are actually several places above, there are like 6 or 7 places above the loss of another family member, believe it or not. A spouse or a child are the ones that are the most difficult. Divorce is a huge grief process. The loss of a job, even retirement, is a grief process. But for me, the big one is when you lose someone you love, because there's a cutoff point. You will never have a chance again. And it made me reflect on the times when I have grieved this way in my life. When I was very young, I lost both of my grandparents on my mother's side. Both, I think, before I was 16 or 17 years old. One when I was very young, and one when I was in like my sophomore year of high school or something like that. Those were not so keen for me. I didn't live in the same town as my grandparents, and it might have been different if I did. But, I only saw them once a year, and so it wasn't a huge, it wasn't as significant as it is for some folks. But the first time I felt loss very keenly was my friend David. When I was about a year out of high school, my friend David died, and what really made it hard, he was 17 years old, and it was a senseless and tragic and avoidable death. And I came home, and my father was the one who had answered the phone, and he was the one that was at home. I don't remember where my mom was that night. Probably at a church function, knowing my mom. And my dad came, and I walked in, and my father was actually holding my niece, Katie, who was a little baby and who's in her mid-30s now. Actually, her late 30s, but we won't go there. And he had tears in his eyes. It's one of the few times I ever saw my father cry. And he said, I wanted to let you know that your friend David died. And he explained what he had heard. And he said, I want you to know that I'm here for you. This is not something my dad normally did. And that's the first time I ever, or any of us ever, heard the story of how he lost his best friend from high school in a similar way when he was also very, very young. So we shared that sort of shared grief. And at the same time, a wonderment at it feels unjust. I've been involved in funerals, whether attending or helping to plan and execute funerals for people who were lost young, and sometimes in ways that seemed unjust. Medical malpractice or a horrible accident. Things like that. A little later, when I lost my own mother, it felt that way. She wasn't as young. She was literally days shy of her 60th birthday. Which means now this year, half of their children will reach the age of 60. And 60 is a big deal for all of us because of that. But it seemed so young, and it seemed unjust. Now, she had had cancer multiple times in the last 16 or 17 years of her life, so it wasn't so unexpected. And she did live long enough to see all of her children become adults. But it feels unjust, and that's kind of the question that's being posed to Jesus that he's responding to at the beginning of our reading today. Why does God let these bad things happen? Now, let me tell you the answer that will get me a little bit cranky every time. Because I've seen it happen too many times where I have been either at the bedside of someone who's suffering and about to die, or perhaps I am at one of these funerals that some funerals are a great celebration of life, and some are just like, oh my gosh, trying to make sense of this. When somebody tells you this was all part of God's plan, the hair on the back of my neck, what little there is, stands up, and I get very, very cross, and I try to keep it inside unless I'm preaching about it, in which case I'm not going to do that. Now, for those who think that what seems like a capricious act by the Supreme Being to take someone that they loved away from them is part of God's plan, I have great news for you. It is not. And that's what Jesus is saying here. That's what he's saying here. Do you think that something bad happened to somebody because they sinned more than somebody else? This is actually good news, folks. The good news is no. So if Jesus had been at one of these funerals, except for the ones where he went where he raised the person from the dead. Okay, let's assume that he didn't raise someone from the dead at one of these funerals, because he didn't always. I don't know why he did this day and didn't that day. I have no idea. And let's remember that everybody he raised from the dead died again later. If somebody would have come to Jesus and said, was this God's plan? Jesus would say, I got news for you. Nope. And then he might have said something that we say in our vernacular that kind of makes sense. You know what? Stuff happens. I can't imagine this coming from the mouth of God, but that's essentially what Jesus is saying here. You live in this mortal sphere. You live on earth. The kingdom of heaven has come, but it's not all here yet. And your flesh is not able to just keep going. It's going to give out. And when it happens, it is not an injustice. Can I tell you what the best thing about grief is before I kind of go on? Because I always like to mention this one. I remember talking to somebody years ago, and I'm not the only person that has said this, and you've heard it from other people before. And they had lost somebody, and it had been about a year or 2 years or something, and they were really having a hard time getting over it. And this person said to me, I just want this hole that has been left in my heart to be filled. And I said, no, you don't. If that hole gets filled, then this person you loved was never worth loving. But they were. This hole that you now have in your soul is a very, I think it was C.S. Lewis called a terrible mercy. Your way of knowing how significant this love and this person was. So you must consider that when we carry grief forward. But now I want to switch gears because Jesus, when they put these three little pieces together for the narrative lectionary today, and when I first started looking at it, I thought, I'm like a lot of people do, I'm just going to pick one of them. And I just put, as you can see, I put all three of them out there because they're kind of tied together. Because what happens next is Jesus tells this parable. And normally, I've been reading the Bible so long that it's very rare that I have a brand new insight that I didn't notice before, just because so much of it, it's not that it's boring, but in this particular case, something occurred to me. I had always skipped past this parable because it's so hard. this parable of the vineyard. But I noticed that the owner of the vineyard has been waiting 3 years for this fig tree to have fruit. 3 years? And then I noticed that about this time, Jesus has been doing his ministry for about, wait for it, 3 years. Jesus has been preaching the reign of God, the reality of God, what it means to be a follower of the creator of the universe for 3 years, and nobody's getting it. Remember last week, we talked about the parable of the Good Samaritan. And you basically had someone who's an expert in the law and has heard Jesus preaching and teaching, and his reaction to loving God the most and loving your neighbor as yourself, even though he has listened to this stuff, is still, well, what's the least I can do, Lord? What is the very least I can do? So as I was walking into the building this morning, I was thinking about that as someone pulled up in a car. And they rolled down their window as I was walking in and they said, "Excuse me, are you a member here?" I thought to myself, oh, this is a trick question. Because I'm not a member here. Did you know that? I'm not. That's the way the Methodist Church works. So I said, "No, I'm the pastor." She says, "Oh, you're the person I want to talk to. I am on my way," and I don't remember where she said she was coming from and where she was going to. She says, "And my car is on empty. Is there any way that you can help me?" And I thought to myself, well, you know what? I could just pull out, I normally don't have cash, but I have cash today in my wallet. I could just pull out some of that and give it to her. But then it was a little bit of a whisper. It's like, you know what? I don't care how much money you got in your wallet. You empty it. Just empty it. I said, "Look, I don't carry cash much. I have some here. You can have it all." And I don't think that's what she was expecting because she seemed delighted. I don't know if it was true, folks. I don't know if I was being had. I don't know. I don't care. Nobody asks for money that doesn't need it for something, right? But what that teacher of the law last week was asking is, what's the least I can do? That person's not my neighbor, is she? She doesn't live anywhere near me, right? But we learned last week, no, the neighbor is the person that you find on the way. I'm not touting my own goodness, because you know what? Any one of you would have done exactly the same thing. I just know it. I really do know it. I'm sure of it. So, Jesus has been preaching this message of loving God and loving neighbor, which, as we learned, is not a new idea. They understand that those two things are connected. Their culture understands that. And everybody's looking for a way to not do it. Jesus has spent maybe months, maybe even years, preparing his disciples for the fact that he's going to go to Jerusalem and he's going to be killed. And they still think he's going to lead some kind of a revolution, and it's not going to happen. They think it's hyperbole or something. They're not getting it. In other words, the owner of the vineyard has been sowing this fig tree for 3 years and there's no fruit. None whatsoever. And then the worker says, let me work it a little bit more. Let me work it a little bit more and let's see what we can do with this. Let me fertilize it and aerate the soil and do whatever we can and tend this thing, and maybe we'll have a better luck next year. And then Jesus ends the parable with a happy ending. Nope, he leaves it hanging. I love that. Because that's where they're at this point. The kingdom is here, but it's not. The reign of God is among you, but it isn't. Not quite. And so what I love this picture of, I wonder if Jesus wasn't thinking at that moment, you know what? I don't have to go to Jerusalem. This isn't working out. I'm the Son of God. I can decide my own destiny. I can choose to go any way I want to, and these people, frankly, aren't worth it. The leader of them, Herod, is trying to kill him. By the way, when he says, you go tell that fox about Herod, next time somebody tells you that if you follow Jesus, you always have to be polite, remember that Jesus, he threw shade when he needed to. You go tell that fox, I'm on my way. And by the way, when he got to Jerusalem, even though Herod is supposedly the ruler here, Herod didn't have any jurisdiction there. So he was escaping from Herod's jurisdiction. According to one commentator, that was sort of going to really be kind of a thorn in Herod's side because Herod is trying to kill him. When Herod has the opportunity, he refuses to be the guy that pulls the trigger, doesn't he? He says, no, you send him back to Rome. I'm not going to do this. So Jesus could have just said, I've had enough of this. These people, it's not going to work out. I even gave my disciples the power to cast out demons and heal the sick, and they come back and they still don't get it. And on the day of crucifixion, they will all run away and hide. No, I don't have to do this. This fig tree is producing no fruit. I give up. Let's find another one. Let's cut this down and burn it up. That's not in Jesus' nature because of God's great love for you and for me. So then you have to ask yourself, what was the fruit that he was looking for? And I think back on two things. One of them is how Jesus started this whole thing. In Luke, way back 9 chapters ago, Jesus walks into the synagogue and he preaches a very brief sermon on this scripture. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and the regaining of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, which is the year of Jubilee, where all debts are canceled and all slaves are freed. Jesus is basically saying the reign of God is here. And how do we bring it here? How do we obey it? How do we live into it? How do we live in the reality of what God is doing in the world? We found out last week. There's hundreds of rules and laws in the Old Testament. Which is the greatest? Everybody knew it. You love God the most with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and you love your neighbor as yourself, and that means you find your neighbor on your way when they get in your way, and you even go out of your way to make sure that you love that neighbor, that you do whatever it is required to restore them, to lift them up out of whatever it is they are in, to work for their healing, to take them to the inn and pay whatever is necessary out of your own pocket until they recover. So what you ask yourself as you're thinking about that fig tree this way, you ask yourself, how did that work out? How did that work out? We get the answer. Luke writes the answer. It's a little later in the Bible, and I'm skipping ahead to probably what's going to be who knows, maybe this is going to be a sermon in a few months. I don't know. But I do know that when the Holy Spirit comes, everything changes. They were devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Reverential awe came over everyone, and many wonders and miraculous signs came about by the apostles. All who believed were together and held everything in common, and they began selling their property and possessions and distributing the proceeds to everyone as anyone had need. Every day they continued to gather together by common consent in the temple courts, breaking bread from house to house, sharing their food with glad and humble hearts, praising God and having the good will of all the people. And the Lord was adding to their number every day those who were being saved. I had an exchange this week with someone who is a Christ follower who was basically using a great handful of scriptures to explain why we should not bother loving and caring for the poor. And I said, shame on you for saying such a thing. You can, if you want to, you can go to this Bible and you can find, if you pick out scriptures, you can find whatever you need to justify whatever it is you've already decided you want to believe and how you want to live your life before you ever encounter it. But you know something? One of the reasons I love this little church is because I absolutely and positively know that that's not what you people do. I've seen it. I've seen it. You see it on Wednesday nights when people come in here who have need of a meal and don't deserve it. We want to give to the person that deserves it. That's not what Jesus says. They shared with each other. It has a look to it, the reign of God. It doesn't make splashy headlines. It's just little things. So yes, I would say to you that on the day of Pentecost, something started where that fig tree started to bear the fruit that God was looking for, that the owner of the vineyard was looking for, and that worker was justified in saying, I'm going to work this a little bit, and we're going to make this happen. And the people of God are going to be an example to the world of how you love God the most and how you love your neighbor just as yourself. And you take care of people regardless of whether they deserve it because they have a need. Let us, you and I, always look for the ways that we can continue to be those people who show the fruit in this garden of loving God the most, loving our neighbor as ourselves, lifting up the downtrodden, proclaiming good news to the poor, release to the captives, freedom for the prisoner, the year of Jubilee where everyone has God's favor because of the great work of Jesus on the cross and rising from the dead, so that we can be part of God's family, God's sharing, loving, generous family for all eternity. Will you pray with me? God in heaven, thank you for the opportunity that we have to be part of a reality that is the same reality that you created on Pentecost, when all of those believers had everything in common. Help us to move from our grief at wishing that the world was different to action that makes the world a different place, that transforms the world into the very reign of God on earth. We are your plan to do that, and we are in awe of that responsibility and that opportunity to show God's love everywhere we go, to everyone we encounter. And all of God's generous, loving people, fruit-bearing branches of the giant fig tree that is the reign of God, said, Amen.